When I was a kid, the world's greatest chess player was Bobby Fischer, a Jewish kid from New York. Now the greatest chess player is a computer, but never you mind. Fischer's success inspired me to learn chess. I became VP of my middle school chess club, and chess is a game of strategy. This sparked a long-standing fascination with geopolitical strategy. And over the past few weeks, as the situation in the Middle East continues to rapidly shift, I found myself reflecting on chess strategy as a lens through which to understand these events. When 1,000 pagers exploded, some thought, this is an immoral war crime. Others were stunned by the movie-like brilliance. Of course, there were the pundits and Western politicians who worried about escalation, as though every event since October 7th hasn't been an escalation. While these interpretations captured people's attention, I just thought, check. Check is what you say when your opponent's king is under attack. And the goal of chess is to capture the opponent's king, which is known as checkmate. But check doesn't mean you've achieved that. It simply means an attack has occurred. Exploding pagers, check, but not checkmate. When Israel assassinated the Hezbollah leader, after having previously dispatched most of their other leadership, that was a secondary call of check. As the attacks on an opponent's king increase, the temperature of the game rises, and uncertainty as to whether the last attack is check or checkmate grows. I think we're kind of in that moment. Of course, for Israel, it's never quite clear who the opponent is. Is Israel sitting across the board from Hamas, Yemen's Houthis, Lebanon's Hezbollah, or the chess grandmaster, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei? Conflict in the Middle East has spanned decades and involved not just direct combatants, but proxy forces, broader alliances, and deeply ingrained values. The Israel-Palestine conflict, particularly with Hamas, is like a complex, dynamic chess match where each player's moves have both short and long-term goals. Chess can help us understand the conflict and how we in the West react to it, because there are parallels between chess's opening, mid-game, and end-game phases. And these can help us discern the context as well as how we think about our Jewish identity, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. Grasping our strategic setting can help us address the emotional and moral trauma that war inflicts on us all. So the opening, setting the stage. In chess, the opening is crucial. It's about controlling territory, the center of the board, setting up for future moves. The same can be said of the early stages of the Israel-Palestine conflict, beginning in the pre-state period. One significant player in the opening round since October 7th, as we all know, has been Hamas, the Islamist group governing Gaza. Hamas's 2017 charter, this is the milder of them, declares its ultimate goal to be the full liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. And for them, Israel's right to exist is not a negotiable issue. While many American Jews are critical of Israel's right-wing government or its military strategy, sentiments that I often share, it's hard to see how a shift in or change in leadership or a reduction in military action could move Hamas's fundamental goals, which have been in place since it was founded in 1987, namely the end of Israel. Within Hamas's militaristic formulation of jihad, and it's important to emphasize that's as opposed to Islam's spiritual understanding of jihad, for Hamas, martyrdom and armed resistance are acts of valor and divine duty. Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's former leader, exemplified this thinking when he said, "We are a people that yearn for death, just as our enemies yearn for life." In this mindset, death in battle is not a defeat, but a victory, part of a larger mission. Mid-game strategy and tactics. The mid-game is where chess's true battles unfold. Pieces are moved, sacrifices made, and control of the board shifts with each move. Tension rises as both players aim to weaken their opponent's position. For Hamas, tactics like tunnels and missile attacks are part of a long-term strategy. Sacrifices like martyrdom are strategic moves. We view such losses as tragic failures, but for Hamas, resistance is integral to identity. Nasrallah, the former leader of Hezbollah, once said, "Martyrdom is a victory, even a moral and religious imperative." And this is a key mindset difference. Because it's hard for us to understand, it becomes easier to blame Israel with all of its failures, its occupation of the West Bank, the siege on Gaza, or other reasons as the root cause. Or, on the other hand, to blame Hamas for using human shields as a tactic. These are fundamental mistakes, what in logic is referred to as category errors. We assume that our love of peace is universal, but it's not. Just as Patrick Henry once said, "Give me liberty or death," it's important to remember that some people's values are dearer to them than life itself. The West and the mid-game misreading the board. While Hamas and Hezbollah are engaged in these mid-game tactics, the West often seems to be playing an entirely different game. The US and Europe prioritize avoiding escalation and maintaining peace. It's as though we think a chess game can always remain in the opening stages. And consequently, we often misread the long-term goals of groups like Hamas. In chess, misreading your opponent's intentions can lead to unexpected setbacks. The West's focus on de-escalation and peace-building doesn't align with Hamas's objectives, which center on resistance. Hamas doesn't seek peace. Hamas seeks total victory. It's in the 2017, the milder charter. Since October 7th, we've seen how this disconnect plays out, with Hamas's rejection of Israel's right to exist clashing with Western hopes for a negotiated peace. And because of that, it doesn't really matter whether Israel or Hamas is responsible for scuttling any potential ceasefire. Doesn't make a difference. Militaristic jihad and Western misunderstanding. In the Western worldview, escalation is often seen as a primary enemy, and that stems from a desire for peace and the avoidance of broader regional or global wars. Good goals. But this approach misreads the ideological motivations of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah while losing moral clarity. In Western warfare, the goal is often a clear victory followed by peace. In contrast, the militaristic jihadist perspective frames conflict as a never-ending struggle until ultimate goals are achieved, such that every loss is a clear victory. And I don't know why that seems so difficult for many to accept, but it is. Western diplomatic efforts, for example, often overlook the deeper ideological motivations and religious motivations behind jihadist warfare. For Hamas, jihad is a holy struggle, both physical and spiritual. The idea of continuous resistance underpins a refusal to settle for anything short of complete victory. As former Hamas leader Yunus al-Astal once said, "The Jews are brought in droves to Palestine so that Allah wants to relieve humanity of their evil." This belief can't be swayed by Western calls for peace, at least it hasn't yet. Endgame, resolution, or stalemate. In chess, the endgame brings clarity. With fewer pieces on the board, each move becomes more critical. The goal is to turn small advantages into a victory. For Israel, the endgame is about securing its existence, ensuring lasting security. For Hamas and Hezbollah, the endgame remains the destruction of Israel, as stated explicitly in their charter. And that creates an ongoing tension. Israel seeks a peaceful resolution with secure borders. Groups like Hamas view any compromise as failures. And yes, Israel complicates their desire for secure borders because of the conditions in the West Bank and Gaza, some of which are of its making and some are not, and we have to own that. Nonetheless, the fundamental dichotomy between Israel's goals and Hamas's makes a peaceful endgame seem almost impossible. Like a chess stalemate, the conflict feels locked in place by irreconcilable goals. Emotional tenor, from tension to desperation. So chess has an emotional flow. It moves from optimism in the opening to tension in the mid-game and clarity or desperation in the end game. In 1948 and the rest of the opening game, Israel was an American Jew's miracle that could do no wrong. As we moved into the complexity of the mid-game, however, many American Jews feel frustrated with Israel's government and the tragic and large-scale loss of life. For some, it now seems that Israel can do no right. Western society prefers clear winners and struggles over the ambiguity of ongoing conflict. Some scholars suggest that historic anti-Semitism was fueled by the perception of Jewish powerlessness. Now, with Israel firmly established and defending itself, that narrative has shifted. For some, it's no longer safe to hate Jews directly, so criticism of Israel has become more common, sometimes crossing into anti-Semitic territory. As the ideology of settler colonialism has taken root in parts of the intellectual and political left, it has provided a framework that casts Israel as the oppressor. Yet, much like a chess player misreading their opponent, this framework overlooks the complexity of the board. This framework can also be found directly in Hamas's charter as part of its justification for the complete destruction of Israel, because Israel's mere existence is unjust. In other words, settler colonialism is a decades-old strategy, not something we're just seeing for the first time on college campuses. But Israel has nowhere to go, and therefore these strategies remain ineffective. Conclusion, understanding the game. Chess teaches us that every phase of the game requires different strategies and objectives. Each move is accompanied by emotions, fear, hope, anger, and anticipation, even overconfidence. Sinwar, Hamas's leader, has admitted that had he known Israel's response to October 7th, he never would have attacked. Overconfidence led to strategic error, just as it did on Israel's side, who really thought they had the strip contained. We often say that peace is the ultimate goal, and I hope for that outcome as much as anyone. But sometimes our well-meaning desires are a luxury to those who don't have skin in the game. The term luxury belief was coined by Rob Henderson, a social commentator. He introduced the concept to describe beliefs that confer social status on the upper class while imposing costs on the lower class. According to Henderson, these beliefs are a form of luxury similar to material goods that signal one's elite status without necessarily having direct consequences for those who hold them. They often involve ideas or positions that the affluent can afford to endorse without personal risk because they make us feel good. Who doesn't want to be on the right side of history? The West's condemnation of Israel and even its premature calls for peace appears like such a luxury belief. This game is in play, and an imposed peace at this point is actually more likely to be a decoy or gambit, a feint in chess meant to throw one's opponent off guard so you can regroup. Those who fall for such a decoy stand to lose a great deal. And there's also, it seems to me, a certain arrogance and indifference when we assume that all people or cultures share the same goals. As I mentioned earlier, Ismail Haniyeh once proclaimed, "We are people that yearn for death, just as our enemies yearn for life." For groups like Hamas, the conflict is more than just a political struggle. It's an existential one, a source of identity. It is larger than life itself. Chess may not provide answers, but it can help us understand the game being played. The tragedy of geopolitical games of chess is that they involve real lives. Too often the lives of non-combatants who are involved and lost. Children die. So many children die. And it is horrible. That's why most of us don't seek a seat at the table of geopolitical chess. It is an ugly game. But just because it's ugly doesn't mean it's not necessary. And it doesn't become less ugly when we respond based on our own cultural biases or believe that we can distance ourselves from the horror by condemning one side. Two lessons from chess. First, looking strategically provides emotional distance so we can respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. Second, strategic thinking opens opportunities to change the board and foster empathy on both sides. Empathetically appreciating each side's goals and purposes frees us to think more creative, especially regarding what can be done to change cultures. Sinwar, for example, often says his time in Israeli prison taught him to better understand his sworn enemy. There's no shame in having empathy for the enemy. It's a good tactic, and it's good for the heart. Can we set up a different chessboard so that this doesn't need to be a win or lose game? Isn't that what so many of us desperately want? That sounds like a reach, however. One of the most startling outcomes that occurred when artificial intelligence began to play chess, is that it taught human players strategies and approaches to the game that had never before been seen, let alone imagined. The most ancient of games was reinvented. And that's why I understand and have sometimes fallen into despair over the Middle East and this way in which we seem stuck in an endless cycle. But new ideas and approaches are still possible. We don't need to merely criticize the moves that have been played. As the new year begins, Jews are reminded that the past is not merely prologue. Although history often repeats, it doesn't need to. New gameplay is possible, as AI taught the chess community. For that reason, I hope that you will deepen your connection to Israel, invest time learning facets of its history that you didn't know, but more than anything, I hope that you will not throw up your hands in despair and walk away from the table or dehumanize either Palestinians or Israelis, for those are also luxury beliefs. Remember, please remember, if history has taught us anything, it's that eventually peace wins. In Leviticus 26:6, God made a promise. I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none will make you afraid. I will rid the land of evil beasts, and the sword will not go through your land. It may seem far away, yet I believe that time is coming. And on that day, on that great day when peace is ultimately victorious, all of us, every one of us, will be able to shout, checkmate, amen.